Next, from Chicago, we hear a presentation by SIU Professor Charles Leonard, who discusses his recent poll that uncovers what Illinoisans are thinking on a variety of issues affecting the state's future. This runs about 30 minutes.
Well, I want to introduce Dr. Charlie Leonard. He is a visiting professor at the Institute, and he has supervised our public opinion polling work for several years now. Charlie, we rely on him for a lot of expertise about all this math and coefficients and margins of error and all this arcane stuff. But our goal, our purpose in doing the polling that we do is to provide policymakers and reform groups and citizens with information they need to know about public opinion in order to make intelligent decisions. And we've done this now for about 4 years, and I think it's been a real contribution that we make to the debate. If nothing else, we get people talking about it in the newscasts and so forth, and I think that's worth something there. And we are very careful to keep, Charlie's very careful about keeping this poll to the highest standards we can. So we got cell phones, and we're trying to account for Spanish-speaking respondents. We really want the document to be a credible poll. We don't use any pollster who does any work for an Illinois politician. We pay for this poll out of proceeds from the endowment fund, so we're not using tax dollars. We really try to make this a document of integrity. And I just encourage you to check out our website when we do release the polls, because we try to get those posted as soon as possible, and hopefully they'll be a useful tool to you. And finally, if you have ideas for questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email or Charlie, and we'll try to get them included on our next document. We have graduate students who are their request for research on there, and it's a useful tool for students trying to do work in researching policy issues for their dissertations and projects. So with that, I will turn this over to Dr. Leonard. Charlie?
Thank you, David. Am I on, Brian? Okay. Well, I appreciate your interest and your attention and being here today. I'm going to run through just a few highlights of the 2012 Simon poll, and hopefully I'll try to keep it shorter than my customary 50 minutes, as though you were not a room full of undergraduates, and leave you some time for questions. Let's get this out of the way first. We boosted our sample size. We normally interview 1,000 Illinois voters in our fall Simon poll. This year we went for 1,250, and the contractor went a little over the night they finished. We'll take them. That comes to a margin for error of about plus or minus 2.8 percentage points. We use a random digit dial method. They're live interviews. We have our respondents spread proportionately across Illinois. We include cell phones to the extent we can afford them in our sample. I believe this year's sample had 15% cell phones. For you survey nerds, they're about twice as expensive per interview to get a cell phone, so we pay extra for that. We have the questionnaire translated into Spanish, and bilingual interviewers are easy to come by in San Marcos, Texas. My colleagues and I, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Grant, and Director Yepsen, wrote the questionnaire, and Customer Research International of San Marcos did the phoning. Good, reputable, smart contractor. Here's some fun time series stuff for you. To start a survey, pollsters typically ask some warm-up questions, like, are things in the United States going in the right direction, or are they off track and going in the wrong direction? How about your state? Right track, wrong track. How about your area where you live? Right track, wrong track. And these go back to our 2008 poll. The top line is your city or area, and you see, as is typical, people are a lot more likely to say things are going well in their city or area than in the country. The typical pattern is that people are more likely to say their state is going in the right direction than the country is going in the right direction. And we're all upside downy here in Illinois. It's always fun to play history with time series polls. 2008, things bad in the country, things bad in the state. 2009 comes along, we're all hopey-changey. And things go down, and this year in 2012, direction of the country popped up significantly. But look at this. Quinn, then disappointment, under 20% saying things in the state of Illinois are going in the right direction. Interestingly, Governor Quinn's approval rating was up 5% or so over last, 7%, John, over the poll we did last year. But I add this just because it's thematic. Is our reputation for corruption adding to this pessimism about the direction of our state? Notice I didn't answer. We asked some questions about the extent of corruption in Illinois and sort of could roll an index into something we could call culture of corruption if we wanted. We said, what about in business in Illinois? Would you say corruption is widespread in Illinois business? And we're a little surprised, maybe we ought not to have been, to see 6 in 10 say they thought corruption was widespread in Illinois business. 3/4 say corruption is widespread in Illinois government. Some reporters I've spoken with were kind of surprised by that 60% number too, but I guess if you think politicians are on the take, well, who's doing the bribing? It's not other politicians. That may be a little too flip. Then we asked, do you think Illinois is more corrupt, less corrupt, or about the same as other states? Thinking, well, maybe Illinois, that's the same everywhere. But they don't think that. About 6 in 10 think Illinois is more corrupt than other states. A little over 1/3 say it's about the same. 7% or something said we're less corrupt than other states. I'd like to go find them. Statewide, people say, well, their city or area of the state is more corrupt. Most voters say their area or city is less corrupt than other parts of Illinois. My government is not. Like those guys, twice as many in Chicago as in the total sample think their government is more corrupt than other parts of the state. Pass on the easy punchline. In the Chicago suburbs, it's about the same as the total sample, maybe a little bit less. And in downstate, which surprises us in southern Illinois to learn that Galena is downstate. Perhaps we're geographically challenged. But it's like by Wisconsin, right? Downstate, about 7% say their area is more corrupt than other parts of the state. Maybe I could get that zip code, that area code for Dixon. I made a few of these little fever chart things for questions that we have time series on. So going back to the 2010 survey, we asked if they would strongly favor, oppose, or strongly oppose term limits. 5 state rep terms in a row, 3 state senate terms in a row. That top line is strongly favor. You see that's pushing 60% every year. The green line is somewhat favor. That gets us to 80%, más o menos, every year for the last 3 years. Now, we are divided at the Institute on any given day whether we think term limits are a good idea. But I can guarantee the state legislature doesn't think term limits are a good idea. And one thing we kick around is whether you know, that's the sort of thing that would motivate politicians to make some reforms, even if, as we start, around the margins. We also polled this year on leadership term limits, and the numbers are about the same for leadership term limits, say for the Speaker and the President of the House, pushing 80% strong favor plus somewhat favor. But I don't have a time series on that. Now I'm going to do just what the PowerPoint gurus tell you never to do, is crowd a slide with type, so I'm sorry, I just did it one time. When you look at the report, you'll see that we ran a whole bunch of disclosure items and asked people if they thought it was very important to know, somewhat important, not very, not at all important to know if a candidate receives loans on terms better than what is available to the public, or is a lobbyist or related to a lobbyist, or is a leader in organizations that may receive tax dollars, or if it was important to know if a candidate was, you know, reported to the state legislative ethics committee. But those sorts of things don't have to be reported or disclosed under current law. This is a very important number, and all but one of these items, more than half say it's very important to know that. And when you look at these, some of them just seem common sense, and as Dave Yepsen alluded to earlier, for the vast majority of honest public servants, they wouldn't have any problem with this. I don't see how it could cause such a terrible problem. As we were discussing at the bar, a couple of colleagues and I, well, what if somebody did disclose that? Is anybody paying attention? But at least it would be out there. And at least somebody could stand up and say, I introduced legislation that made you tell me I was married to a lobbyist. We tested a few conflict of interest provisions. 60+% favor prohibiting legislators from voting on bills that would result in substantial personal profit. There's a concept. The law right now suggests that a legislator might want to do that. About the same number favor prohibiting legislators from having business contracts with the state. They're somewhat more charitable by a little about prohibiting legislators from working as a public employee while they're serving in the legislature. That doesn't pop as high as things like wanting to know if someone was reported to the Legislative Ethics Committee, but it's still strong support, I think, on two of those. We also tested a statement about revolving door. We change our question formatting around to keep from boring respondents and making them hang up on us. And sometimes when we want to test something that really does have two strong sides to it, we ask respondents to listen to us read two statements and then to tell us which one comes closer to their views, even if neither is exactly right. And you can't ask too many of these because they're long. One said, to reduce the likelihood or perception of corruption, we should impose a 1-year waiting period on legislators after they retire before they can lobby their colleagues. And the other question, we try to make these equally persuasive just to see which pops. And the other one, to me, equally persuasive, says contacting government officials is a constitutional right, even for former elected officials, to contact the government for redress of grievances. I think it's pretty high up in the Bill of Rights. And only a quarter chose that second response. So they really like the revolving door legislation. All of our contiguous states have some kind of revolving door provisions. Even Kentucky, which is contiguous down by us. Another quick aside for the politics junkies, Southern Illinois is great. We get campaign commercials. We get Missouri, as Dr. Jackson from Arkansas says, Missouri campaign commercials, and of course when there's a race of interest we get Illinois too. Here's another time series back to 2010. Limit the amount of money party leaders can redistribute to other candidates in the general election. It's been changed at the party primary level, so we changed the wording in 2010 to talk about money that leadership can redistribute during the general election. And there's the strong favor again, not quite 50%, and the somewhat favor over 20%. Very popular reform. Would you favor or oppose a change in the primary election process in Illinois so that voters do not have to publicly declare which ballot they have chosen? There's 60% strongly favor. That decline is not real. It's statistical bounce, I posit. And the green line is somewhat favor. Look at the gap between strongly and somewhat favor. And it makes sense that independents and self-described moderates are a lot more likely to strongly favor the anonymous primary. If you're an independent, you don't like to go in and declare which one you are. So these are, the short answer is support is high and it stays high for these reform measures. Although we'll have a whole conference in Springfield on redistricting, we loaded a couple of redistricting questions into the ethics poll. We described to respondents how the tiebreaker works when there is a partisan tie on the Illinois redistricting panel where someone draws a party's name out of a hat, and then that party wins and gets to impose its own map. Really. A Lincoln stovepipe hat. And we asked whether voters approve or disapprove of that. I didn't include that slide, but they disapprove. I haven't listened in on any interviews, but I suspect they are aghast. Here's something interesting, though. When we first started asking this in 2009, the somewhat favors were high, and the strong favors were relatively lower. Look how the strong favors have crossed over the somewhat favors as intensity of feeling on this issue grows over time. That's when my little chart is finally interesting. Thank you for bearing with me. The lines move. I love it when the lines move. Here's another moving line. Since 2010, we've been asking the independent remap panel question. What if an independent panel drew the maps and the legislature voted up or down on it? And look at the strong favors pop up from the 20% to over 40%, while the somewhat favors stay similar. So intensity of opinion on this, on the redistricting issue, is growing, I posit. Glad this isn't a job talk or something rough me up. We asked about Citizens United, and we read a description of it, and 2/3 said they opposed the decision, and half said they strongly opposed the Citizens United decision. But we sort of have a split decision on campaign cash. Here's another one of those. Here's two statements, choose one question. Limits on campaign contributions are necessary to avoid corruption or the perception of corruption. Complete disclosure is important, but not enough. And the competing statement was, money always finds its way into politics. The way to fix corruption is to require complete, immediate disclosure. And I don't know what to make of this. Sometimes when we ask this kind of question in a survey and we pose two reasonable statements, you get a coin flip. So I don't know. It could be that people are really engaged on this question and there really is a sort of a tie, or people haven't thought that hard about it and I read them two. I've taken them away from feeding the kids and I read them two statements and I go, quick, pick one. And they go, B. So we're still trying to parse this one out. Jim, here's your question. Your young relative has been arrested for a serious DUI. He has just graduated from college, cue the violins. His wife is pregnant with their first child, and he must have his car to do his job. Your relative has hired a veteran lawyer who says if you'll give him $1,000 in cash above his fee, he can make it go away. Do you tell your young relative to accept the lawyer's offer or decline the lawyer's offer? Guesses? Accept how many? Half? More? More than half. Ah, social desirability response. No, they lie. Again, I'm being flip. I don't know that they're lying. We know that when we poll people and we ask them something that's socially desirable, like when you screen for likely voters, and 70% of your sample swears on the family Bible they're going to vote, and you get 35% turnout. Oddly enough, the younger respondent is, the more likely they are to say they'd accept the offer. Jim, how about your classes?
That's why I think there may be some bias in the question in terms of first interview being aware he is responding to the reviewer.
Right, your students respond anonymously, right? Well, and again, this is without context. So I don't know if I ran this and someone mentioned Iowa. I don't know what I would get in Iowa. Brian, can you make this one hot? Thanks.
I didn't tell you, Terry Martin is from the Illinois channel is here taping this, and we're going to air many of these segments on the Illinois channel. That's why I'm being obsessive about this microphone.
I tried to put the question, and I did it for seven different courses that I taught at the U of I at Urbana, in such a way that it sounded practical to them, but that they understood what was being suggested to them. And I can't be certain that they all understood this, but I had a sense that they did, and 2/3 said go for it. In one class it was 19 out of 23 said go for it. And when I asked why did they say that, they said it's the way it's done in Illinois. Everybody else does it, that kind of thing. These were seniors in an American politics class, many of them headed for law school, where they'd...
It's that extra $1,000. That's all I brought. So I'd be delighted to answer questions and entertain suggestions for future questions. Dave, we've got one already. One in the front and one in the back. Mr. Microphone Obsessive. One in the back, one in the front. You choose. Plus, I have a laser.
Hi, I'm Emily Miller today.
Hi.
In terms of looking at so people may care about a particular issue, but do you have a way to gauge whether they would actually be willing to do something about the fact that they care about it? So your numbers moved significantly on the independent panel for redistricting, for example. So, and term limit numbers were pretty high.
Yes.
But will people actually come out and go get signatures and do the extra step? I mean, to me, that's the missing answer.
Not very many of them.
Is there a way to test that? Do you have numbers?
Well,
for that?
we ask if they strongly favor or somewhat favor something, and we can sort of get at it that way. There are other things that political scientists have done to go validate the behavior of a respondent to a survey, like go check and see if they voted and that sort of thing. We don't attempt to do that. So if you see strongly favor a lot higher than somewhat favor, and if you see strongly favor move, then you could make some assertions about how a voter might behave. But you can't say, would you go stand out in front of Kmart and gather signatures? So it's best to be modest about what this tool can measure. That's a pretty long-winded way of saying, I don't know.
This is a rather technical question, but one I think that is becoming increasingly relevant. Why is it so much more expensive to poll cell phone owners?
An easy technical question.
And are you trying to adjust your methodology at all to get more cell phone owners, because more and more every day people are exclusively cell phone owners?
Yes. We did increase it this time. It costs more because you essentially have to make an appointment. Cell phone caller. When you call my house and I'm watching Wheel of Fortune, I walk over to the phone. If you call my cell, I could be at the ball game, I could be on the Dan Ryan, and it's all labor time.
So in other words, it's just not as productive to call a cell phone number.
It just takes a lot longer.
Yeah.
I have not looked at refusal rates on the cell versus the landline phone, but it's a thing. I think a third of households are cell phone only right now. If you're as nerdy as I am about it and read Nate Silver's blog,
yes,
538.com, he did a long piece about how automated dial surveys can't call cell phones.
Right.
And the younger household is more likely to be a cell phone only household. So there's Pew found this a couple years ago too, that there's a slight to significant Republican bias to surveys that don't call cell phone. And so Silver gives more weight in his model to polls that are live interviewers and that call cell phones.
Charlie?
Oh, yes.
In your beginning slides, you had talked about people's perceptions of corruption. How did you define corruption?
We didn't.
So it's really...
We let it mean whatever it means to the respondent.
Have you ever tracked support or opposition to multi-member districts, cumulative voting?
No. No, we haven't. It'd be really hard to explain in a poll question. I suppose there's one out there I could find, but it is an interesting question. Kent had a question. It is interesting.
I was interested in terms of what you're reading on term limits, and having gone through pre and post term limits in 90, 2000, and now we're at 2010. There's a lot of interest in term limits the 2 years in the run-up. There's a lot of interest the year afterward, and in between, nobody talks about term limits. And so, I'm sorry, not redistricting.
Right.
I'm sorry,
right,
redistricting.
Right.
Yeah, and so it's going to be. I will be pleasantly surprised if the intensity of interest in redistricting keeps up there. or whether once people go through a couple of elections and get comfortable with their districts, it becomes another process question that they really don't care about, and they're either happy, it's about their own individual rep and stuff. So when it'll be interesting to see whether you get a decline.
If we get some decay in that after
whether,
another
whether
cycle or
the
two.
intensity of the new maps is kind of as an intervening variable.
Yes, and it is arcane after a while. So if somebody wants to try and get that done, as I was saying to a colleague earlier, I think it needs to be a professional, expensive, statewide media and information campaign.
And it's likely to be every time every time another year goes by, it's going to be harder to get it done.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
Other questions?
There's one in the back, Dave.
Yeah.
While I agree with what you're saying, the new ward map of the city of Chicago has not gone into effect yet. It will go into effect in the next election. So redistricting among city voters may be very much alive in a couple of years.
I don't know very much about that process at the city level, but I suspect that an independent remap panel of the city might meet some resistance.
What do you say it could be derived?
Well, because the new maps of the city of Chicago have already been drawn, but they were redrawn after the last election and do not go into effect until the next election, and some of those new maps are significantly different from the existing maps.
Okay. So people might get hot about that.
Yes.
Okay.
Chris?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. A lot of these questions that you ask, and this is something that's not your survey's issue, it's a general issue when these questions are asked, but to what extent do you think that the intensity or the level of negativity has to do with just the general American dislike of politicians? And how can you sort of control for that in some way, such as comparing across time, as you do here admirably, or across states, which would even be better?
I always go to the National Conference of State Legislatures website. Shameless plug. You can look at what other states do, and an earlier comment from the previous panel about machine-style political states versus reform-style political states. You can get some, and I will defend the Elazar political culture typology. So you can look at other states, and you can look at the time and the course of events and see and speculate about whether events are driving part of those fluctuations. I haven't looked.
One more.
How do you test whether the people being polled, citizens being polled, are sufficiently informed to be able to answer the questions?
That would be like a literacy test. We don't do that. We have demographic questions about age and income and education, and we do see education levels driving differences in responses. College-educated people are different from people who've never been to college. And there are fewer don't know responses among the more educated people. And they are more pro-reform, yes.
Jim Nolan, this question relates more to the panel we just had and doesn't really relate to your survey, but it won't be asked otherwise, and it's important, I think, and it's to Dick Lockhart over here, who has been lobbying the state legislature for more than 50 years, and the question is, has the level of ethics changed over 50 years, and in what direction?
That's a short answer. I didn't give the microphone. What did you say?
Gotten worse.
You had a poll question.
Right. I'm sorry. I wasn't going to ask a question about what you answered, but I interviewed about 20 years ago, shows you how old I am, a terrific public servant by the name of Cronson, who was Auditor General at the time, and asked him the same thing. What do you see going on? And he said, during my era, when I was in office, politicians actually believed that there was a line that they could not cross because the citizens would actively get engaged, vote them out. Not anymore. The money has changed that whole dynamic. The other question I wanted to ask you,
Go ahead. If you're gonna, I thought you had
just one more. No, on the poll. The question on the 60% for term limits and leadership limits. Did you look at how that compares across states? Because most of the polling, when they do it on Congress, says, I don't want my congressman out, but I want the next person over.
Yeah, the other guys are bums. My guy is great. Look how my sidewalk got.
We have time for one last question. No one has a question? Okay, Charlie, thank you.
Thank you. The report is on the piano.
Well, what we're going to...
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.